So Alejandro is going to lead us off with pay for delay, preventing competition in pharmaceutical markets.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. Today I'm presenting the first chapter of my PhD thesis named Pay for Delay, Preventing Competition in Pharmaceutical Markets. Bear in mind that this is still work in progress. Now, let me open with a bold truth. We know that without rigorous antitrust scrutiny, pharmaceutical markets risk becoming innovation-proof monopolies where legal patents expire, but sometimes market power does not. We know that these markets are shaped by lots of variables. Firms invest a lot of money in research and development. They take good care of the timing when they launch a new molecule. And especially, they keep good care of protecting their patents and extending them as much as possible. One of such strategies is the so-called pay-for-delay agreement, in which a branded manufacturer pays the generic entrant in order to deter its entrance from the market. In other words, the generic manufacturer receives money so not to launch its own version of the drug in the market. According to the US Federal Trade Commission, these agreements cost an estimate of $3.5 billion per year to consumers. But this is an interesting thing because these agreements are becoming more and more complex over time, and the so-called cash agreements, which I just described, are becoming less common. And we are seeing, for instance, the so-called no authorized generic commitments, in which the originator of the drug or the branded manufacturer promises the first generic entrant not to launch its own generic version of the drug, so that the other generic manufacturer can hold the 6 months exclusivity in the generic segment. Now, I want to study this topic from 3 points of view. The first one is the health economics. We have lots of interesting papers. For instance, Margaret was speaking about the single market in pharmaceuticals, but I also built from the papers from Professor Morton, studying the probability of generics entering the market. Then I also want to contribute to the law point of view, in which we have Manganelli and Lemnos and Temnialov, who under certain different conditions, they study these pay-for-delay agreements under a theoretical model. Last but not least, I also contribute to this literature in the structural IO literature. My paper is quite similar to Duso and co-authors' paper studying the welfare effect of parallels import in Germany, but the methodology is pretty similar to Professors Boccari and Fournier paper. Now, the research question is quite simple, yet very difficult to answer. I would like to quantify the effects these pay-for-delay agreements have in pharmaceutical markets, both from the demand and the supply side. From the demand side point of view, I estimate what would have happened in absence of these agreements. In other words, what would have happened if generics had entered before into the market? This will be my counterfactual scenario and the exercise I perform in the paper. In the other side of the economy, I also study this from the supply point of view, and I try to assess the financial gains both branded and generic manufacturers have from entering these agreements. To do so, I studied the blockbuster drug Androgel, and let me give you a brief grasp of what this market looks like. So this drug is mainly used for testosterone replacement therapy, which is characterized by a problem that men face, which is named hypogonadism. When we face hypogonadism, we don't produce enough testosterone, and we need to take this therapy, namely by this gel named Androgel. Now, this gel was marketed by Solvay beginning in the 2000s, and it was a blockbuster drug because previously, when you needed to treat hypogonadism, you had to take vials, injectable vials to your body, in which you apply the testosterone through a needle to your body, which was very aggressive. However, this was the first drug that allowed you to take testosterone by means of a gel which you apply to your shoulders or to your body, and then you directly absorb testosterone. Now, this is highly relevant, not only because it had a large consumer base, and it still has, but it marked a landmark case in the antitrust world in the United States, namely the Federal Trade Commission versus Actavis case, in which the Supreme Court ruled that these agreements should be evaluated under a rule of reason. Or in other words, each agreement should be seen one by one, and the pro-competitive effects of each agreement should be greater than the anti-competitive effects of the agreement. Now let's take a narrower look at this drug and this particular market. Let me explain you very briefly the timeline of this drug. As I said, in the 2000, Solvay began marketing Androhel, and it quickly became a blockbuster drug. In the 2003, however, Actavis and other generic firms filed the so-called Paragraph 4 challenge under the Hatch-Waxman Act, trying to enter the market. For some years, Actavis and Solvay litigated, going back and forth, until 2006, where the Food and Drug Administration in the US gave permission to generics to enter the market. Instead of entering the market, what we observed is that these generic firms trying to enter the market abandoned the Paragraph 4 challenge, and according to the Federal Trade Commission, they received huge amounts of money from Solvay, namely, in order to not enter the market and delay its entry until 2015. Now, in 2009, the Federal Trade Commission sued Actavis and the other generics in this market because of being involved in a pay-for-delay illegal agreement. The case was remanded through 2 lower district courts until it arrived to the Supreme Court in 2013, where the Supreme Court ruled that these agreements should be evaluated under a rule of reason. Finally, in 2015, we observed that generic entry finally occurs. The story I want to tell here is that, as economists, we have a framework in which we observe a delay period of 9 years in which generics should have entered before into the market, but they didn't. So, in some sense, what we have is 2 worlds. The world in which generics are not in the market and there is presumably a legal delay, and the world where generics enter and then we observe competition. Using these 2 worlds, we can construct a counterfactual scenario and assess the damages of these agreements. Now let's move into the data. The data I have is from Bloomberg Symphony Health, and I have weekly sales and revenues in the United States from January 29 to November 23. Unfortunately, I don't have the gold standard IMS data because of resources, but still I can do a very good counterfactual scenario with this time frame in the data. I observed several characteristics for each drug: the drug name, strength, size, the indicator, whether the drug is branded or generic, and the form. Now, the market is divided in 4 main molecules of the testosterone in different forms. As I said, the first main form is injectable vials, which was the most aggressive one, and then the other 4 remaining forms are the ones you put into your body through the transdermal via. Now let's take a narrower look at the picture of the market. Here I want to emphasize something that hasn't been raised yet in this conference, but the structure of this market shows what one could expect to be the so-called generics paradox, in which generics slowly increase their price, in which the branded manufacturer slowly increase their price in response to generic entry. The idea of this is that branded manufacturers increase their price to capture the inelastic part of the market and the loyal segment of customers before generics enter the market. Androhel is present in topical gel pump and transdermal gel packet, and what we can see is that some years prior to generic entry, indicated by the black dashed line, the price slightly increases. You might have noticed that here there's a form missing, which I needed another slide to show, which is vials injectable. And this one shows a huge disproportional spike increase in price for the branded drugs, which makes us think that this market cross-form is more regulated, more correlated, than one might think. Because even though generic competition was happening already in the 2009 and before, the branded manufacturer increases their price probably in response to generics entering in other segments of the market. Now, this cross-form correlation is what drives to my methodology, and I don't want to delve a lot in what I'm doing here, but basically I'm solving this equation linearly. It's pretty standard, and I'm estimating the demand with respect to an outside option. I have the price coefficient and the characteristics of the drug. I have size and strength only due to my data set. However, the interesting part here is that I use the Verboven framework in which I nest drugs according to some of their characteristics. As I said before, I assume that there is some cross-form correlation, and this sigma 2 over here indicates the nesting level across forms. So therefore, I allow for some correlation between forms. Then the sigma 1 is basically the second level of nest, which is the drug indicator. Again, here I am allowing for some correlation between the generic and the branded indicator within its particular form. That's why it's the two-level nested logistic model. Now, I'm using the usual BLP-style instrument, so no need to talk there. But the cool thing about this is that this model allows me to compute elasticities and consumer surplus and get a better picture of what's happening in the market. Moreover, this allows me to compute the counterfactual that I will explain later on. Now moving to the supply side, this is pretty standard in the structural IO literature. As I said, I don't observe marginal costs, so I define a profit function for each multi-product firm, which is based on the price, the marginal cost, the share of the firm, and then the market size and minus the fixed cost. If I take the first order condition and apply some derivations, which is in equation 3, I can apply some derivations and arrive to equation 4, in which I isolate the marginal cost as a function of the price, the quantity, and the observed markup, and then I can back out marginal costs. Now let's move to the interesting part of the paper, which is the counterfactual. As an economist, I face this problem, and I say, what would have happened under two scenarios? The first scenario is asking myself what would have happened if generics had never entered the market. This is the so-called no-entry scenario. I'm not showing this in the presentation, but you can find it in the paper. The most interesting counterfactual is the second one, which is what would have happened if generics had entered earlier in the market. This is the no delay scenario. In other words, what would have happened without the delay. To do so, I artificially augment the choice set in all periods previous to the observed generic entry in the status quo. How do I do so? I take the first 8 generic products that enter the market in the status quo and artificially put them in markets prior to generic entry. In other words, markets prior to 2015. The products chosen are the 8 ones, which I cannot show because I have no pointer, but it doesn't matter. But they were chosen in basis of 2 reasons. First, they were the first generics entering in the market in the status quo. And second, the 8 generic products introduced in the counterfactual were all involved in the pay-for-delay agreement. Now, I compute an algorithm in order to recompute the market structure under the new equilibrium, and it's quite simple, following more or less the Hausmann style. First, I take the mean utility of each product, accounting for product characteristics. This is, I keep the characteristics of the product the same as observed in the status quo. I keep the marginal cost at their post-mean introduction level. This is, I keep the marginal cost as observed. And the prices. Then I recompute the predicted market shares using the nested logic structure. Then using the system of first order optimality condition in equation 4 of previous slide, I get the Bertrand-Nash equilibrium prices in vector form. And then I keep iterating this until I get convergence of the price vector. Now let's move to the results. Very briefly, to show you the demand estimation results, I use product, time, and molecule fixed effects. And results are quite standard. As I add nesting into my model, the price coefficient becomes more negative. And when I use instrument, the price coefficient becomes even more negative, which means that my instruments are good. Now, size doesn't seem to play a big role in this market, but strength seems to play a positive role. And the important thing here is that sigma 1 and sigma 2 are both bounded between 0 and 1. And sigma 1 is greater than sigma 2 always, which is needed for consistent utility maximization. For the purpose of the counterfactual, I will use the third specification, the two-nested logic with instrumental variables. Now let's move to the interesting part, which are the results of the counterfactual. In this table, what we see are three relevant forms in the market. The first two are the forms where androgel is involved, and the last one is a form where something odd is happening, but I want to discuss it. In the first form, where androgel was involved, we see that when we introduce prices into the market, when we introduce generic products into the market, prices decrease roughly by a half. In some sense, I'm claiming that this is the causal effect or the causal damage of pay-for-delay agreements, because if the delay was on hold, consumers could have enjoyed prices that were roughly half than they were in the status quo. In the second row, we can see transdermal gel packet, which is another form where androgel was involved. We can see that mean prices decreased by more or less 3%, which is not quite a lot. However, the interesting thing here is that branded prices increase in response to generic entry. Again, this might be correlated to the so-called generic paradox, in which branded prices increase their price in response to generic entry. Same thing happens for injectable vials, which were competing very aggressively in prices in the status quo. However, when generics enter the market in other forms, remember that androgel was not in the vials injectable segment, prices spike dramatically. This might be, again, to the cross-form correlation that I've pointed before in the market. If we take a narrower look at what is happening here, let's see the mean prices for the topical gel pump segment where androgel was involved. In blue, we see the original line where around 2011 prices start slowly increasing, reflecting again the generic paradox thing. However, for the branded and generic simulated prices under the counterfactual, prices collapse to a mean of 6, 7, more or less. What I claim is that the difference between the lower bound and the blue line, the lower bound of the two lines and the blue line, is the causal effect of pay-for-delay agreements. Again, what we see here is that if products would have entered before into the market, consumers would have enjoyed lower prices in this segment where androgel was involved. Now, what I've shown here is that these agreements really undermine the core mechanism of pharmaceutical competition. Firms seek to extend their patent as much as they can, and they engage to these some sort of dark strategies to extend their monopoly power. And in response, they delay consumer access to more affordable generic alternative. I want to give food for thought here, and of course, regulators should focus on price levels, which is important, as shown here, but also on market timing. And I want to connect this with the presentation that Margaret gave before. I think, in some sense, we need to increase the transparency requirements for these paragraph 4 settlements, because when we see a firm abandoning a paragraph 4 challenge, especially when they already won this challenge, there must be a reason behind. Bear in mind that generics in the 2003 won the case, in the 2006, sorry, won the paragraph 4 challenge, and they could have entered the market. However, they didn't because of this pay-for-delay agreement. Now, to wrap up everything, this case illustrates how these illegal agreements delay access to cheaper medications. By using a structural framework, what I do is simulate the world where the delay never happened. Prices for some products could have been reduced by roughly 50%, especially in relevant forms where androgel was present. Of course, consumer surplus would have been substantially higher in this case. I want to give a note here, and the idea is that this is not just a particular case. This is not just cherry picking of androgel. I took this case because I observed both worlds, and it's a very interesting case, but this really keeps happening, especially, as I said in the introduction, with different forms of compensation, which makes it even harder for antitrust authorities to conduct, to analyze these cases. For instance, in Europe, we've seen roughly 5 years ago that the Teva cephalon case led to a 60.5 million fine for delaying the generic for delaying the generic entry of the modafinil version. In the United States, very recently, we've seen the Jazz Hikma case, which has very recently has been settled by paying a $145 million fine. Now I want to wrap up this by saying that these are not just legal concerns, which we need to take care, but this is not just a legal problem. They are really costly for public health systems and consumers. And this should remain still a priority for competition authorities because this still keeps happening. Thank you very much, and I'm open to questions.
Thanks. I think we can take a couple of questions. Marty? Why don't you just go for it?
Sorry.
I can chop into the people online.
I know, but
I think is the problem.
yeah.
That I think.
Thanks, Peter. So I agree with your broad policy conclusion. That makes eminent sense. But just a couple small detailed questions. For your counterfactual simulation, is the branded manufacturer rationally anticipating entry by generics throughout both in the pre and post period? That's one. And second, in terms of generic entry, do you have, is that equilibrium entry or is it just an arbitrary number? Because both those things could alter. I'd be very surprised if qualitatively it would alter your policy conclusion, but it could change actually what the numbers are in the simulations.
Could you please repeat the first question again?
I'm sorry?
Could you please repeat the first question?
The first question, does the branded manufacturer anticipate entry by generics in the counterfactual?
Yeah, short answer, no, because this is not a dynamic game. It's just static, and I don't apply any dynamics.
Because that might move those numbers down.
Of course. No, this is just a static game in which I take the 8 generics, as I described, introduce them into the market, and see what happens statically. No anticipation. And then for the second question, no, I don't apply any equilibrium here. So this is just arbitrary, or in other words, what I observed in the data, because the model is as it is. I took the discrete choice because I think your question goes in the line that one could think, okay, Alejandro, you have the perfect setting for a diff-in-diff estimation in which, okay, you just compute damages and then you are done. This is true, I could do that, but I think it's very interesting to perform this counterfactual exercise in which I can claim better the causal effect of this agreement by introducing the generics in the market. But still, I will keep that in mind. Thank you.
Okay. And then I think this has to be the last question, so we move on to...
Thanks.
Yeah.
More of a comment than a question, but given the data you have in terms of price and quantity in your counterfactual, you could probably calculate the counterfactual profits. It would be interesting, I think, to see how that differed from the actual profit share arrangement they had from the pay for delay. Did the firms get it correct when they were doing the pay for delay agreement, which I imagine you'd have in the settlement or the case data?
Yeah, so that's a very great point. I've just done this like the last week, and first results show that the pay for delay firms under the counterfactual scenario get really low profits compared to the status quo. So yeah, this is pointing towards, again, more or less the same result, right? Yeah, but this is still a work in progress, so I'm taking that into account. But yeah, I will compute it that. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
So we're deviating slightly from the printed program, but Maria will present next.
Yeah, so my presentation is somewhat related to pay for delay agreements because that's a tactic that we see by originators that happens towards the end of a patent term or after expiry, and also divisional games is something that is a strategy deployed by originator companies when the end of a patent term of the original compound patent is in sight. And this is joint work that I did with Kalpana Tyagi, who is an IP scholar from Maastricht University, and Marek Giebel, who is an economist at Copenhagen Business School. And I have two notes towards our work before and our work now. So the question that we address in the paper is essentially under which circumstances divisional patent applications or divisional games can be harmful to competition by deterring generic entry to the detriment of consumers, and how, if patent or antitrust law could prevent harm from such strategies. And I'll just briefly say what divisionals are to get everybody on the same page, and then I'll dive into some guidance that we could get from economics. And here comes the first caveat. So we used to have a game theoretic model that Marek very carefully developed for our paper, and then it was smashed during peer review because we didn't quite manage to, marry the legal analysis with the economics analysis to all of those who are doing law and economics. So we decided, okay, we're going to have two papers, or at least one pretty legal one, and then see what we can do with that economic model, game theoretic model. So I'll refer more generally to the kind of welfare effects that we can learn from general economic theory about divisional patents. And then I'll dive into patent law and competition law and what these two fields of law could do in order to help any harmful effects from divisional patent strategies. Now, what are divisional patent strategies? So they're essentially a situation where the owner of a parent patent divides the application into several sub or divisions of that parent patent by filing multiple follow-on applications based on that parent patent. And here you can see an example of a divisional strategy where you have in the very, very first line, right, that compound patent that essentially can get in the European patent system a protection of 20 years. And then you can extend that through SPCs, as we've heard from Margaret, by 5 years, maybe even further 6 months because of pediatric application. And then what a patent owner that wants to engage in a divisional strategy will do is that at some point, right into the patent term of the compound patent, it will come up with follow-on patents, process patents, for example, various ways of producing the compound that then are patented. Those tend to be weaker than the primary patent. And the same is true for usage patents. So, for example, filing a patent for different forms of oral and other types of administration of a certain active ingredient. Also, those tend to be weaker. And then these follow-on patents, usage and process, are further divided up. For example, I'll apply for a patent for a 20 milligram dosage every day of the week versus a 40 milligram dosage 3 times a week. I will apply for pre-filled syringes that contain the active ingredient versus syringes that need to be filled. So this is how they keep going about their divisional applications, and that creates a so-called patent thicket, right? And each of these divisional applications, they get their own life, right? So if, for example, as you can see, the first follow-on patent is revoked or withdrawn even before grant, the follow-on patents continue living in that sense as individual patent applications that then can be granted, that can be opposed, that can be withdrawn. And it's kind of the uncertainty that is created through that thicket that can deter generic entry. And the question is, when should we find that kind of patenting strategy unlawful? Because it does harm to competition in unjustified ways. So what does economics tell us about, do we have a clear guideline from economics as to when a divisional filing strategy will be anti-competitive? And the thing is that, in principle, economics tell us, well, patent rights are good if they are granted in the right scope, because they will incentivize innovation, and that temporary monopoly that they give will allow to recoup research and development costs, right? But we also know that overbroad patent protection is bad for welfare, because we do want to ensure access and entry when it comes to pharmaceutical markets by generic entrants. That's why we have regimes like the Hatch-Waxman Act. And the ultimate goal is that we need to find the right balance, right, between static competition, price-based competition that comes from, for example, generic entry at some point, versus dynamic competition, so innovation and quality-driven competition. And in principle, litigation is a good tool to reach that balance, right? Because you will have both the patent owners that can resort to enforcement if they think there's unjustified entry or an infringer on the market, but you also have the generics producers that can challenge patent applications and that can also respond with invalidity claims in infringement proceedings. So in principle, that does not really help us, because we think that, well, divisional patents might have also an innovation incentive for pharmaceutical producers, but at what point do they become anti-competitive? If you have any ideas on a precise standard of defining this, come to us, because we're still looking for it. But in general, whether or not a divisional strategy will be successful essentially depends on the success of the application in front of the office, and then a successful or the likelihood of success in an enforcement procedure before a court. And the likelihood of success of obtaining divisional patents depends on the one hand on the sophistication of the applicant. Do you have the deep pockets and the drafting skills and the experts in order to file useful patent applications that then can be divided up in divisionals? What are the patent office's policies? So the EPO, for example, for a while limited the application of divisionals to 2 years after filing of the parent patent in order to reduce the amount of divisional applications. But then they dropped because it got jammed because so many divisional applications were filed. So they had to drop that policy, but that can be a factor. And then when you look at court proceedings, so once you have an application pending, right, you can already go to court and, try to get injunctions and so forth to against potential entrants, or once the application has been granted, it also depends on what a court will do. How will they interpret, the requirement of novelty of a patent and of the divisional? What kind of remedies will they grant? Will they be quick to give preliminary injunctions, to stop generic entry? Will they wait until they have completely examined the case on the merits and so forth? And then the question is also, there might be also interference from a competition law perspective. So what kind of arguments, what kind of enforcement priorities do we have from that side that could influence the success of a divisional strategy? Now, if we look within patent law and whether patent law could tell us something about whether a divisional strategy is good or bad, lawful or unlawful, or harmful or fine, in principle, divisional strategies are completely legitimate as from a patent law perspective. They might undermine the spirit of patent law, which is to reach that right balance between, a temporary monopoly versus access. But at least under Article 4G of the Paris Convention, we have in the implementation, for example, of that provision in Article 82 of the European Patent Convention, we have the requirement of a unity of a patent. So one patent is one invention. And therefore, an examiner, for example, that sees a patent and patent claims and says, oh, there's more than one invention in here, might request that patent is split up. But it's also the applicant that can decide to split up the patent into further divisionals, right? So you have those two modalities, they're in principle completely fine. Now, when could there be harmful effects? So the question is, when do these strategies deter generic entry for example, while the validity of a divisional is being litigated, and that delays the entry, precisely because there is uncertainty as to whether a certain patent is valid at the end of the day. So there are certain examples from patent law where we can argue that there is harm. So for example, many here in the room might know, talking about pay for delay, the European Commission's decision in citalopram against Lundbeck, where Lundbeck got into pay for delay agreements with generics producers regarding citalopram, which is an antidepressant. But there were also, Lundbeck also engaged in a huge divisional game in relation to citalopram. So for example, there was a patent on the crystalline form in order to produce citalopram, which was a kind of process patent and divisionals. And that patent was considered weak from the beginning. It was granted eventually, and then it took 4 years in order to revoke it, because it was found invalid ultimately, and also to revoke the divisional. And within these 4 years, essentially, Lundbeck could continue to be the sole seller on the market, right, of citalopram. Also in the Biogen Nurex Farm case, so that was a drug produced by Biogen against multiples, or for the treatment of multiple sclerosis. And in this case, it was called Tecfidera. And in this case, there were several Biogen filed injunctions, preliminary injunctions in several member states of the EU against divisional patents. And when that, even though, for example, the parent patent had already been revoked, but the divisional applications were still pending. And so in Germany, for example, the courts rejected to grant an interim injunction against the generics entrants that wanted to enter the market, because they said, we think the likelihood of this patent being declared invalid is so high that we're not going to give that injunction. And in Ireland, actually, the High Court first said the same and said, well, you know, if we grant now a preliminary injunction, probably this will cost the public sector 5.5 million euros until the merits of the case are decided. And therefore, we don't want to stop generic entry at this point. We first want to see what the merits of the case bring. And that decision was actually overturned by the Court of Appeal that said, no, if we have a patent application that has not been revoked, has not been declared invalid, we accept that. And then we can also grant an injunction on that basis. So these are the kind of problems, and we also see that in the case of Teva and Copaxone. So this is the case that the European Commission took up. Now, coming to solutions under patent law, what could patent law do in such situations? Now, if we look at the procedure to apply for a patent and for divisionals, we see that in the European Union, we do not have really a tool to question the intent with which a patent application was filed. So we cannot know what the intention behind a filing strategy is. We just don't have the tools in the law for the examiner to ask that. We have in the US, for example, the patent misuse doctrine developed by courts, but we don't have an equivalent in the European Union. And even in the US, that doctrine is contested. So there was the suggestion to limit the time for which you can apply for divisionals. The European Patent Office tried that to a limited amount of 2 years, but it didn't work because it just jammed the system. So the last question is, can the Unified Patent Court help? It cannot help in terms of the application process that happens in front of the EPO, but it could at least maybe reduce the forum shopping that can happen after a divisional application is pending, when originators and generics start getting into litigation in several member states with different outcomes, because the Unified Patent Court would have jurisdiction over either unitary patents exclusively or the traditional European patents if they have not been opted out of that mandatory jurisdiction of the Unified Patent Court. But as things stand, 500,000 European patents at the moment have opted out. So the owners of 500,000 European patent registrations have opted out of the jurisdiction of the Unified Patent Court. So we don't really see a solution under patent law to address the problem. What can competition law do? So under competition law, we had an investigation by the European Commission that started in 2021 against Teva for delaying generic entry of drugs with the same active ingredient as Copaxone, which is also a multiple sclerosis drug. And essentially, the European Commission alleged two types of abuse. First, a disparagement campaign against competitors, but then also a misuse of patent procedures due to these divisional games that Teva was playing in relation to the patents that related to the Copaxone drug. And then last year in October, the European Commission actually came out with a fining decision against Teva for these both abuses taken together, and imposed a fine of 462 million euros against Teva. Now, do we now know what competition law has to offer in terms of differentiating between legitimate and illegitimate divisional filing strategies? I'm not so sure. So I'll skip the whole analysis of how the Commission established that Teva was dominant in the relevant market. It established that, and then the question was, well, how did it argue for there being an abuse by Teva for its divisional strategy? And the Commission said, look, we're not interfering, it came to the existence exercise dichotomy. We're not interfering with the existence of these divisionals as such, but the way they have been exercised, that is what has been the problem. And it said, well, first, the practice of Teva to filing staggered divisional applications and then withdrawing them at times, and then filing for injunctions in front of national courts, and then, dropping them and so forth, that entire conduct as a whole artificially prolonged uncertainty regarding the validity of the remaining patents that were there, and that hindered generic entry. That's the abuse. And then the Commission said, and we also need to show exclusionary effects, but that was very simple. The Commission said, well, we know that Synfon, your generic competitor, could not enter the market because of your strategy, so there you have your effect. And there's no legitimate justification. So Teva said, oh, we dropped our patent applications selectively because we wanted to reduce costs. And then the Commission said, oh, well, and then you just file a new application? That makes no sense, that's not credible. But essentially, the problem with this decision is that it's extremely long. So the abuse analysis is more than 100 pages long just for the misuse of the patent system, and we don't really know what the exact legal test is at the end of the day. Because if you do that once, you're not violating antitrust rules. If you do it twice, probably neither. It needs to cross a certain threshold, but we don't know exactly what that threshold is, which is a problem from a legal perspective. Do we have any convincing precedents from before that would give us a clear legal test? No, we don't. We have the pharmaceutical sector inquiry from 2009, where the Commission first said divisionals could be a problem. We need to address those. Then there was a complaint by Amaral and a settlement decision that came out because Boehringer Ingelheim had applied for patent tickets and Amaral had complained, but they settled between them. Nothing happened. And then we have AstraZeneca, but that was a fraudulent use of the patent system. So that was also unlawful from a patent law perspective. So we don't really know where we stand in terms of what exactly the legal test is to define whether a divisional strategy is anti-competitive. Now, what could we do to establish a clearer test? And I don't really have a solution, I think. I just have a couple of questions. So in Germany, for example, when one of the licensees of Synfon, so Mylan, was subject to injunction proceedings by Teva, it went on its own motion to the Munich Regional Court and said, I want an anti-divisional game injunction from you, court. And the court gave it. Whether that brings a whole host of other problems, but at least what the court said was that the court applied unfair competition law, German unfair competition law, and said, well, the way that Teva is withdrawing its applications just before the technical board of appeal or the opposition division is giving a reasoned opinion whether to revoke the patent or not, that is not, there's no clear legitimate goal for this kind of strategy by Teva, and therefore we're just going to impose an injunction that Teva is not allowed to withdraw those patents, so there needs to be a final decision by an opposition division. That's in terms of remedies. But also here, the Munich court kind of tried to look at all the cumulative proceedings that Teva was launching, withdrawing, applying, and said, oh, all of that as a whole is an act of unfair competition. That's it, and here you have your remedy. Still, it's a bit of a difficult test to apply. Shall we look at dynamic competition incentives somehow? Of course, you might question, well, if we, find this strategy, this divisional strategy, to be anti-competitive, are we doing more harm? Or are we doing because we're harming innovation incentives? And so the Commission looked a little bit into this. It said, well, whenever you were filing your applications for divisionals, you had no R&D in relation to them in the pipeline. So those could not really be based on innovation incentives. Maybe that's a way to go, I don't know. And then lastly, what happened in the European Commission decision is that we usually have the rule that an abuse is usually not based on an intent analysis. We usually don't try to investigate too deeply what the intent of the dominant firm was in a certain strategy, right? Because that requires going potentially into subjective elements that we don't want to go into. But still, if you look at the Teva decision in Copaxone, you can see that most of the evidence relied on to come to a conclusion were the internal emails of the company that were showing that they were aware that their patents were weak, that they were aware that their patents were likely to be revoked if they went all the way through with the opposition or appeals proceedings and so forth. So maybe there is a mix of these elements that we could go to. But, and I think I'll stop here, essentially we can see that these divisional filing strategies and games are a bit in a gray zone. Under patent law, we cannot quite catch them. Under competition law, we have caught them, but with in a way that is not particularly satisfying or that is particularly clear for future cases. Maybe at some point, we already heard about the UPC, there will be at least some reduction of forum shopping that could be helpful to reduce these strategies overall. Maybe having a patent register that at least makes clear how a certain patent family looks like in terms of basic patents and divisionals, that could help, in order to, for generic entrants to see the whole picture of a patent tree and so forth. Maybe limiting the time period for withdrawing applications could be a strategy. Again, that needs to be balanced against other solutions, or a reintroduction of a limit to file voluntary divisionals. Lastly, on the US law, the US courts have been very clear. They've just established a bright line rule under competition law. So, for example, the Seventh Circuit in 2022, in a case between the mayor and the city of Baltimore versus AbbVie, decided that whenever conduct is lawful under patent law, will not challenge it under antitrust law. It's essentially immune. Whether that leads to a desired outcome at the end of the day, if these divisional applications actually can cause harm, that's a different question, but it's definitely a clear test that we don't have in the EU. Thank you very much.
Great. We have a few minutes for questions. Sorry, there's, well, okay.
Thank you. So for the strategies about divisional divisional strategies. This doesn't sound unique to the pharmaceutical sector, is it? Aren't these similar things where you have tickets and so on going on in other markets? So here you're motivating it with things like pay for delay deals that are happening because of that, or generic entry being delayed. What other problems are happening? What similar problems are happening in other sectors? And then similarly, when we're talking about selectively filing or shopping around and removing that, couldn't you look at what's happening in the US? Because over there, you don't have selective filing. When you file a patent in the US, it's for the entire country, not for a specific state, far as I know. So there's no forum shopping, so to speak, over there. So couldn't some lessons we learned from there, that whether any of these strategies would work?
So maybe to the first question, whether you might have faced exactly the same problems in other sectors, probably the one that is specific to pharmaceuticals, first, it's a behavior that we see in the pharmaceutical sector, and second, you have that issue of generic entry that you might not have in exactly the same way in other sectors, right? Where you're really thinking that in order to strike the right balance, well, of course, that's the general intention of the patent system, to have then copycats come in the market at some point in order to drive down prices. But we've actually not gone beyond I mean, maybe also because the literature on divisionals is limited to the pharmaceutical sector. The cases that we've seen are limited to the pharmaceutical sector. So maybe that's why we focus that so much on the pharmaceutical sector. But
Samsung and screens, etc.
Yeah.
Have similar patent tickets, etc. around them, and that come out also in a staggered fashion.
Exactly, exactly. So I agree that it's not something that is limited to pharmaceuticals at all. It's just that how would you then, I mean, in electronics, you don't have you probably have the no-label companies that then should be able to come into the market, right? Whereas, I mean, what I associate with or the kind of smartphone wars, I associate it with big players kind of fighting each other over these thickets, rather than, this dynamic between having a generic entrant and kind of driving the... Just so these are thoughts from the top of my head, but that's kind of the difference that I see here. But maybe that's also worth mentioning, why we actually focus this so much. And the other question was about,
I think we can try and get in one more question. There was a hand up here.
Cheers, thanks so much. Just a quick question on this area. When it comes to the parent patent, do we know what the time frame is when normally they put in the request for the divisional strategy? Like, is it really always in the last X years of the original patent, or is it sometimes done earlier on? And the reason I ask that is that of the different strategies you talked about, I wondered whether putting in a rule that says that a divisional request has to go in the first half of the original parent patent would be something's manageable from a legal framework because it's a set standard you could bring in, but also would help on the economic side because you're starting to bring certainty for both the company who has the parent patent, but also potential outsiders who are thinking about whether they want to invest and work on what would have otherwise been what the divisional is working on. So I just wondered if there's good data on through the process, whether these are happening towards the end of the parent patent life or if they're happening throughout the cycle. Thanks.
So the first thing is that one of the things that we contemplated when working on this was whether we should do an empirical study to get clearer evidence on whether it's true that the divisional patents are filed towards. So usually it is towards the end of the expiry of the compound patent, then follow-on patents have been filed that extend the patent life a little bit of the compound patent, and then the divisional come in the later stages of these follow-on patents, essentially. and are in relation to these follow-on patents. And one of the reasons why we dropped this was actually, and I think that's what also Karen's presentation showed, that it's probably difficult to actually track down the entire tree in the right. So I'm talking for the economists who I'm not right in the team, but I think that's why we didn't go further with that because we thought we would probably not be able to. So the examples that I brought are the ones that show this pattern, and it. If you think it from a strategic perspective, it's probably also the most sensible, right? Because it's that moment where, you know, every day of still having your market monopoly will still bring you a lot of profits, and any means is good, you know, to hold on to that. Well, yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks. I think we'll move on to the last paper.
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity. For those of you who do not know me, I'm not Rita Bennato. I'm just replacing her. I'm Franco Mariuzzo. So last week she had to pull out for family reasons. So I decided I'll take over the presentations on a topic. And so this presentation is on the title is Killing Me Softly. So far, what is it missing in terms of the pharma? What is missing is the topic of killer acquisitions, I think, you know. And then you can say, well, you already know a lot about killer acquisition. So I thought we knew a lot about patent delay. So most of the topic we covered so far, we've learned a lot. We're still in the process of learning. So into that respect, I was approached this year, probably around March, to try to work on a paper together with a list of authors that are there. So all the people that you see that without a person involved are those that have contributed to what I'm going to talk about now. And basically, I'm just, you know, telling what it is behind the study. And my role is to come in, you know, for a research paper, which is what we're working on now. So as I say, I'm not presenting a paper now today. I'm going to present, you know, a study that's been done. But I do hope I guys convey the information. There is something interesting going on here. There's something perhaps unique that can give this kind of, you know, different view of, if you want, the role of killer acquisitions. So there is, if you're interested, there is a full report of 350 pages available from the European Commission's called Ex Post Evaluation, EU Competition Enforcement and Acquisition of Innovative Competitors in the Pharma Sector, leading to discontinuations of overlapping drug research and development projects. Very long title, so as long as so is the report. And but again, gonna show you some of the key results here today, and then what is novel and what is different and what has been done so far. There are 13 authors, if you want, that contribute to the paper, but very importantly, it's a mixture of economists, if you want, consultancy, but experts on the field that they could be able to validate the process. Okay, long introductions, but you know, I want to make up the point is that, you know, so far, what we know about killer acquisitions, there is a very famous paper, I think all economists will know, but also the non-economists by now, by Cunningham, Ederer, and Ma, that, you know, they published in the Journal of Political Economy in 2021 about this, you know, process of firms that, you know, they go through a merger and acquisitions, and part of the strategy of the merger and acquisition is simply to kill a competing line of projects, okay? And that has effect on competition and innovation, of course, and they were able to quantify the effect, which is about, you know, 5 to 7.5%. They were able to assess to be the impact of this killer acquisition. So it's a very strong impact, if you want, in terms of firm strategy, in order to one part of the reason because you might be merging is because you want to reduce, you know, affect what was the competitor possible in the market, in an important market, put you on a project, on a research and development. So that's what is, if you want, underline that. We're going to take a different stance here. When I say, let me use the word we, although I've done nothing, but let me use the word we because I found it very hard to say they sometimes. But they've done lots of work here, basically, in this project, and in trying to find out, you know, what happens if you really look into these cases, for example. That's why the European Commission wanted to issue these important, if you want, call, because their interest to say two important interests. One is, can we try, for example, to understand what are these deals, you know, and then can we have a way to understand the characteristics of these anti-competitive deals that we call killer acquisition? That's question number one. part of that we learned already in the paper and the literature that followed. And the second one was very important for them is to do an ex post evaluation of the decision that they took to see if some of the deals perhaps were important and some of the decisions were perhaps, merger and acquisition that we allowed to go through, where that, for example, some people should look into more details about, possible killer acquisition that we might have dismissed. And then, of course, that's part of the story. So it's to do also an analysis on ex post evaluation of decision by the commissions. So this is part of the study. And what the study does use a data set, which is usually large data set publicly available. All, if you want, the information here today I'm sharing with you are based on publicly available data, which makes very good when you're writing a report for the commission, because even if you find perhaps that the decision of the commission perhaps was not right, you can say, well, the commission had better information because they have access to information we did not have, and therefore, even in that case, you are safe in your claims. So apart from that, it complies if you want large data set techniques. So the thing is, how do you identify the killer acquisition? So the technology being used is if you computer science methodology called the lasso model. You put some keywords in, and then you're able to find what are the probability based on a set of, call it, characteristics of finding, for example, identifying killer acquisition. That's your step one. So you let the data play a little bit to identify on that. And then the next step, you get your expert team in order to look at them carefully, make sure that those are possibly killer acquisition. So as I say, there is an important aspect of that is also to look at these assessment of ex post analysis of the decision by the European Commissions. So killer acquisition is, if you want, belongs to the theory of competitive harm, and once it's being identified, because it's a process of, you want, perhaps going through merger and acquisitions and perhaps killing the possible competitions in innovation taking place there, okay? But this happened when the firm acquired the Riva to suppress innovative R&D. That has been defined in the literature by the paper that I mentioned earlier. Sorry. There is also, however, another important aspect is perhaps we are too narrow when we look about killer and acquisitions into merger and acquisition, because there is a much wider world there when maybe killer acquisitions are taking place, and maybe we need to have in mind is the role of agreements. So, and we start thinking about the role of agreements. At that point, yes, merger and acquisition are agreements, but there are a subset of the many other agreements that are possible. So, for example, it could be that the decision is not to try to take control of a company, it's not an acquisition, but you take partial control of the asset. You might have some licensing agreement. You might have an agreement of the form, if you want, of other sort. And if that's the type of agreement we have in mind, maybe merger control will not work there. Therefore, one has to look at this article, maybe 101 and 102 of the treaty, if they can help perhaps in, if you want, facing, if you identify killer acquisition also in this case. So this is a little bit what is happening here. So the paper, you might have already seen, I call the paper, but there's going to be a paper, not yet. So the paper, if you want, this report has structured in a way. The first is a fact finding. So let's look at the data available. Let's identify the agreements. Let's define the market, the relevant market, in a very narrow way. And then we can look at those decisions, if you want, that we can say potentially there might be what's called here a prima facie evidence of killer acquisitions, okay? And, but that's different than what was done in the literature, because the literature referred to the literature to be perhaps the paper by, if you want, Ederer and Cunningham et al. Then in their paper, what they've done is a different kind of definition of, if you want, relevant markets. They've done a statistical approach, whether here is looking to a case-by-case study, and therefore a much, if you want, analysis which is more micro. This project took 3 years to be completed, so it's a long work behind it. And then, so the first part is simply to fact findings, and then do questions we're going to ask is, do killer acquisition, for example, exist in practice or not? And how frequent or systemic are they? And they basically look at the role of concentration. So one important aspect that is going to come very important here is we have killer acquisition when, this, if you want, killed, if you want, project is affecting competition. If it's not affecting competition in the market, maybe we should not be calling that killer acquisition. So it's not that the counterfactual will be, a project, if it doesn't exist, it means you kill the competition. You need to check if there really was an effect on competition or not, okay? So it's an important, if you want, aspect that we need to keep in mind. As I said, there is an ex-post assessment. I'm going to talk about that with the results of the study at this point, and then talk later about what's going to be the paper we talked about. So as I say here, the theory of Arnold killer acquisitions is a transaction leads to the discontinuation of a research and development project and is likely to result in a negative effect on competition. That is a killer acquisition for us, and even that is a prima facie killer acquisition because we're simply finding there's a potential of a killer acquisition there. The one is to look more careful, okay? So when the European Commission and DG COM called for this kind of study, their question was, can we identify what are the possible, if you want, problematic cases? So there is a way to do that now, but yet then you need to do a proper investigation if these were actually problematic. This is what is called a prima facie evidence of that, okay? So the incumbents do acquire innovators to eliminate future competition. One important lesson we learned also from the paper and the literature is typically the killer acquisitions are asymmetric. You have a large company that enters to the market, perhaps if you want to acquire a small target firm, which is below the threshold of if you merger control. So therefore cannot be typically investigating into that, okay? So that has been studied, and this, which is a little building on that, we're gonna see the most of the deals, we're gonna call it here, are larger deals, and then but there are also many of them below the thresholds. Okay, the fact findings, so let me just go through this one. So the study has assessed all transactions that took place in the pharmaceutical sector from 5 years, from 2014 to 2018. Okay, so that's, if you want, the time period of analysis of all of this has been looked at. And what is important, this includes, if you want, concentration, which is merger and acquisitions, but also has looked at different type of deals, like, for example, research and development agreements, licensing agreements, and asset purchase agreements. And that it becomes more difficult sometimes to have the right information to be able to construct a relevant market and to see if there has been, if you want, a deal that has been killed, okay, or discontinued, which is the word we're going to use here. So the methodology is being mentioned already is being large-scale automatic analysis of publicly available data, and that required to use some, if you want, computer science techniques in order to identify on first, what were the problematic deals and agreements, and then later on to look at them, which one really problematic, and asking also the experts. So the team has 4 experts from pharmaceutical that were able to know what was going on, and looking also at the evidence supported by various sources of information. So it's a manual screening also that require a case-by-case analysis, and later I'm going to show you some of these statistics for those. And then, as you can see, you know, the distinction here from what has been done in the literature is that this is really much of a granular evidence approach. It's really about, you know, single cases, looking them by one, instead of a statistical approach that's been used in the literature. So it's already a big advancement on that. And then if you want, you can read, if you want, the report. The report makes very clear what is the difference between the work of Cunningham et al., what has been done here, but also how to read the results of Cunningham et al. Versus the results we're going to see them appearing here. The data set is, you know, clinical trials. If you want, they have this aggregate analysis of clinicaltrials.gov, which is more of kind of, you know, standardized measure of, if you want, clinical trials. So this is the word. Nothing here is about preclinical trials. All that's being analyzed here in terms of year are from clinical trials onwards. Okay, this is being looked at and linked. And there is also PubMed for additional information, and also we look at the company website, because then you need to match, if you want, this project line to the company that took control of that and were part of the agreements. So if you see, it's also one of the data sets you've been using, Zephyr there, and then add these deals as that. So it's a very, always in my computer here, I don't know, 20 gigabytes of data there that I have to working on. So identification of transaction is the first, and then is identification of the discontinuations that took place. So these are the 2 slides I want to spend a second time. You have to identify the transactions where the drugs were object, if you know, those that could be traced. And as you see here is the paper, what is very important, does look at what relevant market was called the narrow market definition, which is the most important one, and is looking at the case when you're having, if you want, a shared therapeutic indication and a mode of actions. So we're really talking about a fine level. It's not you have a class, if you want, of drugs here that we're talking about, but a therapeutic indication and the mode of action that defines your relevant market. And now you need to find if there are other, if you want, projects that belong into the same relevant market. If the project of, say, of merger and acquisition, if the project of two firms belong to the same very narrow market, okay? So respiratory tract, for example, infection could be one, and then affecting maybe the enzyme. It is just, that could be the market they were looking at, not looking something which is broader than that. So it's a very, very fine, if you want, markets. And the other important is we focus on the cases when both the target and the acquired portfolios appear in clinical trials, of course, and both the object of the deal and the acquired portfolio are active at the time of the deal. So that was the condition for identification of relevant transactions. They also to say there is nothing to do with device here. All about is about human drugs, that in R&D project that relate to human drugs development, not about the device, of course, and then some other, if you want, information. But important also pipeline to pipeline and marketing to pipeline overlaps are, if you do know the literature, typically in an R&D project, there are different stages of advancement of the project. You have stage 1, stage 2, which is ready, project getting ready, then stage 3 and stage 4 was already marketed. So that's the kind of, pipelines. The discontinuation is being identified in no progress in the therapeutic indications is observed after the deal. And all clinical trials active at the time of the deal are no longer active at the end of the observation period. So that's one identification process. So the question is, once you identify the discontinuations, what is very important is to identify those that possibly were problematic, which are called the prima facie evidence of possibly killer acquisitions. So we need to rule out those that perhaps went terminated for different reasons, And then the expert here came very important with their knowledge also on trying to look at their understanding if that disappearance of the project was any reason for that. The study also has to say that there is a treatment and a control group. The control group will be all, if you want, the trials that, if you want, they were not, if you want, discontinued, or those that were just, normal trials that there was no problem. So that will form the control group, and the only one that were, if you want, part of the treatment would be thought to be the one that were, of course, discontinued with prima facie kind of evidence. Okay. That's the point of say here. I get to some of the results, that we think about, about 37% of the deals with narrow research and development overlaps deserve further scrutiny. So in this respect is a small proportions, and it's basically 89 out of 240. So I'm going to come back on this, but I want to first show this table. What we do observe here is some of the main table that we can see in the paper. You have different kind of columns there, but you can focus on the column number 4. Those are deals where at least one narrow overlap could be established. So we are relevant markets that we're talking about there. Supposing a merger and acquisition, both firms were in the same markets. And out of these deals, we can say how many were problematic as identified as prima facie to this kind of, evidence in identifying these potential prima facie killer acquisition, and we can look at the last column. We can say about 89 of these, and 133 basically, which is the third to the last column, is identifying those that were some discontinuation took place. So we've started 240 are, if you want, the cases. 183 of these had a case of discontinuations, but of these discontinuations, there were not killer acquisitions. Only half of that or less were possible to identify as a prima facie evidence of killer acquisition. So it's a very convoluted process to try to get through this stage. And then, so another aspect that was, if you want, here important is you can look at this information by type of agreements. So we don't need to stick with if you want to merger and acquisition. We can look at licensing. We can look at other type of deals that took place. So we're looking really here at terms of agreements. For every agreement now we have a way to have identified potentials, if you want, killer acquisition that took place. Okay, so we can, if you want, widen this up. This is simply show an evidence of very often, the way to read this is when you see the blue emerging is you have an overrepresentation, in this case, of the suspicion discontinuations over, if you want, the control unit. So 2 to 2 is phase 2 to phase 2 is a typical case when you have this discontinuation which could be associated with killer acquisitions, and then in later stages as well. So that's one of the evidence coming out of there. I want only to say one word from this table, and this, if you notice here, focus perhaps into the second column. And the second column, we can see that there is, if you want, some percentages. So with that, for licensing and for, if you want, R&D agreements, it was sometimes difficult to back the full evidence to be able to get an expert to be able to assess if that case was a case, if you want, of a killer acquisition or not. So in this is not, for the other case, it was all information was there. So there is, if you want, some selection taking place for this type of deals, but that's just to make transparent the process. And the distinction on the last column, here we're talking about deals, then we're talking about even the count of overlaps. So it's much larger than the single deals. I'm gonna briefly say important points, and I'm going to run towards the end. Discontinuation are more frequent in market with limited competition. So that was part of the results of the survey, which is an interesting aspect. There is also less likely to face competition from drugs with marketing approval. So the stage of advancement of the R&D, if you want, project is an important one to decide when we can associate these or we identify that to be potential killer acquisition or not. And this also what matters is the value of the innovations, you know. So large acquire only tend to buy smaller innovative firms. This is already what was there in the literature. And then typical deals exceed the 50 million, if you want, dollar value. We hope we have those money at our university, would be good. So ex post evaluations, that's the other part we're going to see briefly. So these I can say there are 5 cases that have been looked at in the report, and of these 5 cases, 3 of them were, you know, approved, if you want, merger and acquisition. 2 were subject to divestors, which were case 7275 and 9294. They were subject to divestor. And by looking retrospectively with the information collected, the evidence was perhaps only the first on the Johnson & Johnson against Actilio could have been a case where maybe there was a need perhaps for looking at these type of killer acquisitions. So if there was being a stronger remedy in the market, there would have been, the drug would have been further developed into that. So there was a potential case for that, but again, it's just, you know, based on the public evidence available, not based on the information available at the commission at the time of the decision, which was also additional private information that usually is not publicly available. So, and I think it's, I can go to this important message. So if one has to say, an important message from the paper is perhaps there is a call now to think of having a registry when all of these kind of, you know, possible lines where the project line are in the same, if you want, relevant market, they should be reported. Any discontinuation that belongs to the relevant market should be reported by the firm. So having a registry where this is simply reporting, so you put the burden on the firm to report that, and if that is done, this is a matter to looking at the small subset of informations out there available. I went through quickly. The original sample of 6,000 deals that we looked at, only 240 of these deals basically were, if you want, possible when you can find there is a narrow, if you want, overlapping in place. And of this one, only less than 50% were identified as problematic, possibly problematic deals, okay? So that's the kind of a structure of this work. And then there is the research paper. The idea of the research paper in one word is we want to exploit now this, if you want, asymmetry that is in place between the different types of deals and what the characteristics that underpin possible, if you want, killer acquisition that being identified in this data set. And that should be more or less what the starting story of the paper is. But if a better ideas, they're welcome. And with that in place, I think I can even finish here and say thank you for listening. And so, and if you have any good question, maybe we can see somebody can answer, but I can give a try. I don't know if Anna is online or not, but thank you.
Thank you. So I'll use my right for preempt. What is the publicly available source of deals?
So all these clinical trials is the clinical trials is publicly available.
Yeah.
There is Addis Diaz, which is publicly available.
But,
And then, when do you
for a price. I mean,
Oh, for prices?
no, I'm just saying, when I guess for me,
Oh.
publicly available means that anyone can go and use it, and I think you do have to pay, right? I just want to be clear.
The report mentioned they were publicly available, and I just said, maybe Anna has the answer. She might have paid for the money. I don't know. That's this one. I thought the clinical trials is publicly available,
that one I
yes.
know, yeah.
And the other, when you have more clean information, PubMed is also publicly available. So the one, Addis Diaz, maybe you have to pay for that. Zephyr you have to pay. So there was already a suspicion in place, so that's true. But the other one, that's all I know. Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
no.
Let me open it up to everyone else. Yes.
Just a small point. You mentioned the issue of merger or acquisitions that are too small to be notified.
Yes.
In the U.S., we can still challenge these, and I think I understand, in Europe, sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. That might be one law or regulation to think about changing to make them available for challenge, even if they're not required to be notified.
Yeah. I think the German system has done something, because one issue is not only about the pharmaceutical, it's also you get apply the same problem, if you want, on digital markets, which were the problematic one for being below the thresholds. The German have found a way to get it around that. Sometimes it's possible retrospectively to hit it back, but yeah, maybe, yes. Thanks. If you have some difficult question, please ask. One of the authors is here. I was only here to present, what I read about that, and also it was a good opportunity for me to try to catch up with the study. Otherwise, it would have taken even longer to go and start working on the paper. So thank you. And that was not planned until this last weekend. So.
Franco, if I have the time, I wanted to say hi to everyone and a very warm thanks to you for helping me, the paper, and also the entire research to step up and help me in the presentation. Apologies for missing so many friends. I hope that I will see you all soon.
Thanks, Anna.
Yeah, great to hear from you, Anna. Yeah, go ahead.
I may have missed it. I don't think you addressed the sort of elephant in the room on the other side, the fact that people enter businesses in order to be acquired, at least at some point. Is there any way to evaluate or balance that issue?
Yeah, the reverse killer acquisition is what we're referring at here, and it's been discussed. I don't think has been looked, the analysis was just mentioned that there is an issue of the reverse killer acquisition site in the literature, but there's not been looked at that. So I don't know if there was any thought about that. It's just,
We thought about it, but it was the focus of the report was more on try to identify if the killer acquisition would occur throughout the merging. And in particular, as Franco presented, he was also looking at cases that they might go under the radium of the European Commission because the threshold has not been reached. In fact, the contribution of this report goes over the fact that we look into deals which correctly Margaret said that they are the only sources that are not publicly available. We had to pay for having access to it. So we look into different type of deals, also small deals like partnership, R&Ds, and licensing, which sometimes not necessarily reach the threshold of the 50 million. So the focus was different. So we wonder if it was the case to consider reverse killer acquisition, but we focus on that part. Maybe it's another opportunity to explore in our research paper.
Okay, I think I'm getting the signal that we have had a very long day. Thank you, everyone, for participating.
Thank you so much, Em.